It is 1963. Somewhere beneath the wheat fields of western South Dakota, two airmen sit in a steel capsule the size of a school bus, buried 40 feet underground. Above them, the sky is wide and flat and silent. Cattle graze. A farmhouse chimney breathes a thin line of smoke. A child plays in a yard, and directly beneath that ordinary American afternoon, these two men hold the keys to a weapon capable of killing 2 million people in under 30 minutes. Most of those South Dakota farmers never knew it. Some still don't. Between 1961 and 1963, the United States Air Force quietly installed 150 Minuteman, 1 intercontinental ballistic missiles beneath the grasslands surrounding Ellsworth Air Force Base, threading them through the counties of Meade, Pennington, Lawrence, and Custer like the hidden roots of something enormous and terrible. Each missile stood 60 feet tall inside a hardened concrete silo aimed at Soviet cities thousands of miles away, ready to launch on a 2-minute command. The infrastructure was staggering. Underground cables, launch control facilities, blast doors sealed with the weight of tanks. And for decades, the full scale of what lay beneath South Dakota's quiet surface was one of the most tightly guarded secrets in American military history. But in early 2026, a tranche of previously classified Air Force strategic missiles documents was quietly released through the National Declassification Center. And what those records reveal about what happened to those silos, not during the Cold War, but after it, is a story that has never been properly told. A story of abandonment, contamination, strange repurposing, and questions that the government has still not fully answered. The ground above those silos looks peaceful. The truth beneath it is anything but. To understand what happened to South Dakota's missile fields, you first have to understand the extraordinary world that built them. The late 1950s and early 1960s were years of near-total nuclear terror. The Soviet Union had tested its first hydrogen bomb in 1953. Sputnik had crossed the sky in 1957, a beeping silver ball that told every American general the same thing. If a rocket could put a satellite in orbit, it could put a warhead on Washington. The comfortable buffer of the Atlantic Ocean no longer meant anything. Distance was dead. The age of the missile had arrived. The American response was the Minuteman program, a weapon designed specifically to be fast, cheap to operate, and impossible to destroy in a first strike. Unlike the liquid-fueled Atlas missiles that came before it, the Minuteman used solid propellant. It did not need hours of preparation. It could sit dormant in its underground tomb for years, and then, within the span of a single minute, thunder out of the earth and into a trajectory that would carry it across the Arctic and down toward its target. That 1-minute readiness was the entire point. It was the insurance policy. It was the thing that made a Soviet first strike irrational, because no matter how many American cities they destroyed, those missiles would already be on their way. The construction of the missile fields was an operation of almost incomprehensible scale. Across 5 states, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, Colorado, and South Dakota, the Air Force oversaw the installation of more than 1,000 Minuteman missiles, each one requiring its own reinforced silo, its own network of buried cables, its own hardened launch control center. In South Dakota alone, 150 silos were embedded across an area roughly the size of Connecticut. The project consumed millions of cubic yards of concrete. It employed tens of thousands of construction workers, many of whom signed secrecy agreements so restrictive they could not tell their own families what they were building. Entire sections of road were quietly widened to accommodate the convoys. Farm access agreements were signed with language so vague that most landowners had no real understanding of what sat beneath their fields. The federal government spent, in today's money, the equivalent of roughly $40 billion constructing and maintaining this system. $40 billion buried in the ground of a state that most Americans cannot locate on a map. The secrecy was not paranoia. It was doctrine. Every detail of the missiles' locations, their technical specifications, their communication systems, all of it was classified at the highest levels. Even the congressional oversight committees received only partial briefings. The people of South Dakota lived above a hidden world, and the government intended to keep it that way indefinitely. What they could not predict was how indefinitely would eventually end. The construction of the missile fields happened in plain sight, which was perhaps the most unsettling part of it. Teams of civilian contractors arrived in small South Dakota towns, driving unmarked vehicles, hiring local labor for what they described as government infrastructure work. The soil in western South Dakota is ancient and deep, a rolling sea of shortgrass prairie underlaid by limestone and shale. To sink a missile silo into it required excavating a hole roughly 12 feet in diameter and 80 feet deep, then lining it with steel and reinforced concrete thick enough to survive a nuclear near miss. Workers on these crews were told only what they needed to know for their specific task. The electricians knew about cables. The concrete crews knew about foundations. Nobody knew the whole picture, and that fragmentation was deliberate. The launch control facilities, known as Launch Control Centers, or LCCs, were different. These were the nerve centers, each one responsible for 10 missiles spread across a roughly 100 square mile area. They were constructed as two-part structures, a surface building that resembled nothing more alarming than a modest ranch house, and directly beneath it, suspended on enormous shock absorbers to protect against blast waves, a steel capsule 45 feet underground. It was in these capsules that the missile crews, always two officers working in paired shifts, spent their alert tours. They would descend by elevator into a space roughly the size of a suburban bedroom, seal the blast door behind them, a door weighing 17,000 pounds, and begin their 60-hour watch. They could not leave without authorization. They could not communicate with the outside world except through dedicated military channels. They were, in the most literal sense, buried alive, waiting for a war that everyone prayed would never come. But there was a problem. Life inside the capsule was designed for duty, not for human comfort, and the psychological toll of that environment became one of the program's most carefully suppressed secrets. Crew members reported extreme disorientation, broken sleep cycles, and a particular kind of dread that came from understanding, at all times, exactly what they were sitting above. The two-person rule, no single officer could ever be alone in the capsule with access to the launch keys, was designed to prevent unauthorized launch. But it also meant that both crew members were permanently aware that their partner held half the authority to end civilization. Some officers requested reassignment after a single tour and were quietly moved. Others developed what the Air Force's own internal reports, now partially declassified, described as elevated psychological stress profiles. The records tell a different story than the official image of cool, collected missile crews in pressed uniforms. The reality was two people in a sealed steel box, 400 miles from the nearest ocean, responsible for the deaths of millions. What they discovered next was even more disturbing. Across the missile field, the buried cable networks that connected the silos to their launch control centers were vulnerable in ways that the Air Force's original engineers had not fully anticipated. The cables ran through conduit buried 3 to 6 feet underground, and the soil chemistry of South Dakota, rich in moisture-retaining clay, was quietly attacking the insulation. By the mid-1970s, multiple cable faults had been logged across the 44th Missile Wing's operational area. More troubling were the reports of communication interference, brief and unexplained signal disruptions that caused certain missiles to go temporarily off-network. These events were classified as bent spear incidents in the military's own nuclear safety reporting system, the category sitting just below broken arrow, which designated an actual nuclear accident. The Air Force never publicly disclosed the frequency of these disruptions. The 2026 declassified documents suggest they were occurring at certain periods at a rate of several per month. The cover-up, if that is the right word, was not a conspiracy of malice so much as a conspiracy of institutional silence. The Air Force understood that public confidence in the missile force depended on the narrative of perfect reliability, sleek, modern, ever-ready weapons under the control of steady hands. Any admission of cable faults, psychological crises among crews, or communication failures would have triggered congressional investigations and, far more dangerous to the program's budget, public alarm. And so the problems were managed internally, logged in classified reports, and kept entirely off the public record. Farmers drove their tractors over ground-hiding faults that the government knew about and had chosen not to fix for budget reasons. Children played above cables the Air Force had classified as degraded. The machine was less perfect than anyone admitted, and the secrecy that had built it also protected every one of its flaws. When the Cold War ended and the first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START 1, was signed in 1991, the fate of America's missile fields suddenly became a question with an actual deadline attached to it. The treaty required verifiable reductions in nuclear warheads and delivery systems. For South Dakota's 150 silos, this meant decommissioning. What that word meant in practice, however, was something far stranger and more troubling than simple demolition. The formal process was called silo elimination. Under the terms of the treaty, each silo had to be destroyed in a manner verifiable by Soviet and later Russian satellites. The standard method involved using explosives to collapse the silo walls inward and then filling the resulting cavity with rubble, creating what engineers called a filled and disturbed condition that satellite imagery could confirm. By the mid-1990s, the Air Force had completed this process for the majority of South Dakota's sites. But completion and closure are not the same thing. Many of the silo properties were simply returned to the landowners or transferred to other federal agencies with minimal environmental assessment. The underground cable networks were left in place, too expensive to remove, quietly abandoned in their conduit beneath the prairie. The launch control facilities presented a different problem entirely. Some of the surface buildings were demolished. Others were sold. A small number were transferred to local governments or private parties under terms that, according to the newly released 2026 documents, included ongoing monitoring agreements that have never been made public. The contamination question is perhaps the most urgent chapter of the post-decommissioning story. Across multiple former silo sites, soil testing conducted in the early 2000s found traces of trichloroethylene, a solvent used extensively in missile maintenance, as well as hydraulic fluid compounds that had leached into the groundwater over decades of operational use. Several sites were quietly added to the Environmental Protection Agency's monitoring registry under designations that made their connection to missile infrastructure deliberately obscure. Local ranchers in Meade County began reporting in the early 2000s that certain wells on or near former silo properties showed chemical anomalies. The Air Force's response, documented in internal correspondence now available through the 2026 release, was to contest the data and delay remediation funding. Some of those wells remain flagged today. And then there are the things that cannot be easily explained. Amateur historians and urban explorers who have documented former silo sites across South Dakota in recent years describe a persistent and disquieting experience at certain locations. The faint hum of electrical equipment in structures officially listed as inactive, ventilation systems appearing to operate in facilities the Air Force has logged as fully decommissioned, and in at least 3 cases documented between 2019 and 2024. The presence of security fencing around sites that, according to every available official record, no longer contain anything worth securing. One site in Lawrence County, formerly decommissioned in 1994, was photographed in 2023 showing fresh vehicle tracks leading to a sealed blast door. The Air Force has not responded to Freedom of Information requests about that site. The requests are listed as pending. South Dakota's missile fields are officially history. The silos are collapsed. The warheads are gone. The 2 officers who once sat in their buried capsule watching the clock and the telemetry screens have long since retired. The launch control centers have been sold, demolished, or transferred. The prairie has grown back over the disturbed earth, and the cattle have returned, and the farmhouses still breathe their thin lines of chimney smoke against the flat winter sky, but the ground does not forget what was done to it. The cables are still down there, rusting in their conduit. The chemical compounds are still migrating, molecule by molecule, toward the water table. The blast doors that were never removed still seal chambers that the public has no legal right to enter and no certain knowledge of what they contain. The 2026 declassification has given historians and journalists a wider window into this story than they have ever had before. But a wider window is not a transparent one. Large sections of the released documents remain redacted. Entire categories of post-decommissioning activity are listed as classified under exemptions that will not expire for another 20 years. The Minuteman missile program was one of the largest and most secret construction projects in American history. It transformed the landscape of 5 states and the psychology of an entire generation of men who lived inside it. It cost a sum of money that would stagger any peacetime government. And when the Cold War ended, it was not so much dismantled as absorbed. Dissolved back into the earth it came from, leaving behind contamination and confusion. What we know is remarkable enough: 150 silos beneath South Dakota's wheat fields, 40 years of buried secrets, a decommissioning process that left the land scarred in ways that are still being measured. We only know about the ones they admitted to. What about the ones still hidden?